What we'll look at today, we'll sort of go through for about an hour or so an idea of some key concepts we look at from the perspective of cybersecurity and data protection. Obviously, a very big, pretty broad area from a business perspective, a big risk area for organizations, and also a big sort of compliance challenge in terms of some of the costs and problems and prohibitions involved. Also a very fast moving area. We've seen that in the last few weeks, just with what's happened with the pandemic. Of course, crises like this tend to increase instances of fraud generally. And what's happened, of course, now with technology is it's increasing instances of fraud from a electronic perspective, so computer breaches and hacks, etc. So we'll look at some of those ideas. The idea of today's webinar, it's a bit of a condensed version of a one-day workshop we run at Aventis, which is on cyber attacks and data breaches, as well as some other courses we run around both cybersecurity, risk management, and data protection, PDPA, as well as GDPR, which we'll touch on a little bit later. You can, or you should all be able to see the chat box. So in there, you can send messages to everyone in the group. So I can see Grace already said hi a little bit earlier on. If anyone has a question as we go through, I know everyone's microphone is on mute because otherwise the background noise is awful. But if anyone has a question they want to ask, feel free to do so. Otherwise, at the end, I'll stay on the line anyway for a while, and we can ask questions separately or discuss topics should anybody have anything they want to go through. So in terms of what we're looking at, some of the challenges for today, and hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. I'm trying to share that with you. Again, if that's not working very well, then someone can feel free to ping me a note. We're looking here at the idea of risk in business, and you can see the chart on the screen here from the World Economic Forum that was produced at the beginning of this year. So top 10 risks. This is a global risk chart. So we're looking here at the things that are issues for people, and we can see both number 2, cyber attacks, and number 7, data fraud or theft. The reality is, of course, risk in business generally, it does fluctuate, it goes up and down. I think most of us, if we went back to the end of last year or even January, probably wouldn't have put a global pandemic as one of the biggest challenges we're going to face in business. And then lo and behold, that became, of course, one of the biggest challenges we've ever faced in business. Cyber attacks and data fraud have been a rising risk issue for a number of years. They're well known about based on instances and events we've had. In a general sense, cybersecurity, cyber risk in business has shot up as one of the top 10 risks everywhere in the world the last few years. And that's the same if we look at this, the variation of this chart for Asia and the Pacific. Cyber attacks number 2. For us in this region, natural catastrophes, of course, tsunamis, volcanoes, etc. But cyber attacks still up there at number 2. Data fraud still at number 7. So huge issues we see in business. What I found interesting in this area of work is the growth really of what we see as events unfold. And what I mean by that is broadly, cybersecurity in sort of Singapore, Southeast Asia, and data protection as well had not been seen as being huge critical risk issues until events occurred. In our case, and we'll come back to this a bit later, of course, the SingHealth data breach, which was a significant driver of change in 2018. And so we see singular events often as being the big driver of change, as opposed to smaller things that happen over a period of time. So that was really a huge driver for things to happen in the Singapore context, although we already had law on things like data protection. One of the reasons we put these two topics together sometimes, and there is distinctions between both the cybersecurity side and the data protection side, is that primarily from a business perspective in the modern age, most of our data is now held electronically. Historic data protection, data privacy was fairly simple in a straightforward manner. We used to put documentation into a cabinet, for example, or drawers in an office and lock it. The office itself was locked, buildings were secure, data is therefore protected. Of course, we're now generating more data than ever before, primarily electronically. We're storing it electronically, we're moving it electronically. All of these issues become not just evolve, I should say, not just from a data issue, but to a cybersecurity issue. How do we protect that electronic data? As I said, most of us are generating far more than ever before. Even simple things generate data on a daily basis. For example, for everybody at the moment, the amount of data flowing backwards and forwards, if you've got children at a school, even on a normal basis, children here at a kindergarten, for example, might be signing in and out once and a second time every day. In some schools, photographs are taken twice a day, logged in a system. This is a huge volume of data to be storing, and now we've got data going backwards and forwards between education institution and parents for things like home-based learning to phones and then emails as well. So we've got a massive volume of data that we're generating every single day, and we're being required to do things like upload pictures to portals, for example. The numbers involved here are huge, and this is data from the US from the end of last year, but you can see on the chart the data goes into 2018. This is from a group called IC3, which is a division of the FBI in America that looks at internet connectivity. You see that the amount of estimated monetary damage here caused by cybercrime and the rise from $17.8 million in 2001 to $2.7 billion in 2018. Even in the last sort of 2 years, if you look at this chart, you're looking at the best part of a doubling here in numbers. And again, with what's happening at the moment with the crisis we're seeing, the pandemic crisis, this will increase again. You know, this will go up as this year progresses. Sorry, I jumped ahead a slide. Didn't know I could do that. So this will progress again through the course of this year, I think, to be another sort of bump up as people are victimized based on what's happening globally. There are, of course, big cases we know about. So this is a chart of some of the bigger cases we've seen in the last sort of decade. I'll come back to some of these as we go on today. So some of them I'll reference a couple of times. Key here is a consideration that a lot of these, there's a linkage between a lot of these different cyber events, in that a lot of cyber events we've seen in the last decade have been perpetrated primarily by groups from North Korea, which we'll come back to a little bit later because this has happened as well in Singapore. One of the challenge we get, of course, is finding out how these things take place, where they're from, who does them, and for what reason. Over time, it tends to become more well known. Groups, particularly places like the FBI in America, do a pretty good investigation and research and find out, or find out pretty closely to what they think has happened. There are broadly only about 5 jurisdictions that have the sophistication to carry out most mega hacks like the ones you can see on the screen at the moment. Really, you're looking at countries like the US, China, Russia, North Korea, and Israel. They're sort of the prime jurisdictions we'd often see linked to these events. When we look at hacking that is done or cyber crime that's perpetrated for economic benefit, it's often done by groups like China, but particularly North Korea. Russia tend to hack, they do hack economically, but for other reasons like politics. So we've seen that with things like their interference in the American election and the Brexit vote in Europe over the last 5 years, where they do it for different reasons. North Korea do it primarily for economic gain. They sometimes have links to China for that as well. So the FBI recently singled out 2 members of the Chinese military. They put on their most wanted or their watch list based on a cyber attack, the Equifax hack, which we'll come back to a little bit later. They've also given pretty good information in the last 6 months on some of the hacking groups from North Korea who've perpetrated the biggest hacks. Of course, for us in Singapore, when we think back to something like Sing Health, the event that took place here in 2018, the likelihood is it was one of the big countries that did that. And the reality is, given the time and sensitivity of what was happening politically, although we don't know for sure, speculation would point probably at a place like China as having committed a breach like that. Costs of dealing with cybercrime are going up, which again is not hugely surprising. If there are more hacks taking place and they're for economic benefit, they're going to be stealing things that are economically lucrative. As there are more businesses doing more business online, which is happening all over the world, it becomes more lucrative to do that. Similar to other elements of organized crime, because most of the hacking events we see are fairly sophisticated. They're not, contrary to sort of popular belief of what you might hear sometimes, they're not some guy sat at home in their bedroom. That does happen, I should point out, on a couple of occasions. There was an interesting breach a few years ago at JP Morgan, a US bank, which was carried out by 3 guys literally in a bedroom in New Jersey. But primarily they're done by very sophisticated organized crime groups. The thing to consider with organized crime is, and you can see this in any gangster film you watch, when somebody engages in organized crime and they're successful, they don't stop. They do it more and they do it at bigger scale. Actually, the numbers involved here could be significantly bigger, based on a couple of hacks that have been stopped in their tracks in recent years. But it's a huge jump. Last 5 years increase economically 72%. So the numbers are pretty staggering. So average cost of cybercrime, $13 million. One thing to consider, and this is where we start looking at the linkage between the cybersecurity side and the data protection side. Most of us just consider our data a thing that's out there and is available. We we don't put an economic price on our data, but actually our data is valuable. So we hear this phrase, a lot of you will have heard this like me for the last 10 years, data is the new oil. And you think to yourself, well, if that's the case, and the data is our data, where's the money for my oil, my data? How much is it worth? If an organization like Facebook is worth, let's say on a given day, $700 million, their share value, billion dollars, sorry, and they've got 2 billion users, then every one of those users has an economic value of at least a few dollars. Why aren't they paying me for the access to my data for selling? And that became a key question in regulatory jurisdictions like Europe, which led to things like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which we'll come back to. So this sort of liberal political viewpoint that actually data is economically viable, therefore I should be paid for it. So there is a cost involved in this. Again, you can flip that on its head and say, for example, in the Sing Health breach, if you look at 1.5 million consumer records being lost, which in this case they were, and a regulatory penalty of $750,000, that puts a price of 50 cents, 50 Singapore cent on every user's record in the country, which is a fractionally low amount. So we're saying our personal and medical records are worth 50 cent a person in Singapore. I know it's sort of a controversial way of thinking about it, but when you put it in economic terms, it's actually quite interesting to think about that way. So cybersecurity, we have various objectives we're looking to fulfill here. We want to keep data safe from unauthorized access, including malicious attacks. It's not just personal data. There's business data. There's sensitive financial data, for example. There's information such as copyright, intellectual property. So if we think about China, for example, has built up a reputation over the last 10 to 15 years for engaging in cybercrime for the purpose of stealing or copying intellectual property. So taking information from others which they can copy and replicate products, for example. If we think about defense mechanisms in a very broad sense, the best defense are us individuals. You know, we like to look at technology as breaking, the technology faulted, there was an issue and the system broke down. That does happen occasionally, but the much more likely issue is that we break the technology, we cause problems, we are the weakest link, humans in many respects. So the thing we do or the problems we cause lead to the issues that allow somebody to take a malicious action against us. So the more responsible we are for handling sensitive information, the better a defense companies have. If we think what's happened in the last 6 weeks, even in a place like Singapore, or even less in our case with the circuit breaker, you know, we've got many, many, many more people working outside of their normal environment. In this case, working outside of an office-based environment, potentially at home. So I'm sure a number of you on the call today, like me, you're probably at home, and we're not as attuned from a security perspective. Some of you might be working on your own personal devices, whether that's a personal mobile phone or a laptop or a personal computer. Some of you might still be using work computers, but you might be accessing data remotely. There's now another huge business continuity consideration. How are we accessing potentially sensitive data remotely because we can't be in an office environment? You know, all of a sudden people are having to rethink the way they work based on a singular event, in our case, the coronavirus issue. So human error can and does play a major role in contributing to data breaches. There's a variance here between two different things. One is human error. We are humans. All of us do make mistakes. It's inevitable that we will make mistakes. Now, the question is, how often do we make the same mistake twice, and can we minimize the risk of that mistake occurring and what it leads to? The second thing is employee error, where we have employees committing misconduct on purpose. So for example, providing access to inside information like security data or passwords, letting someone access a system they maybe shouldn't. So a bit of a difference between just making a mistake and somebody that's actively trying to commit problems or cause problems. So objectives we should have from a cybersecurity perspective, we should be looking to minimize data loss. So not just data loss, but also data breach or access, manipulation. Once data is lost, if it's taken out of a system, you might be able to recover a backup from, say, yesterday, but the data that's gone is gone now. There's no way of necessarily knowing where it's gone, who it's gone to, and for what purpose. If data is manipulated, you'd have a backup from the day before, so security backup, and you could revert to that to make sure you've got a record of the accurate data. We should be looking here at then policies, standards, and guidelines. What does this mean in our organization? If we think of how physical security has changed, we look at mirroring from a cyber perspective. So for example, in many buildings in Singapore, you can't just walk in an office building and get in the lift and go up to level 10 or wherever. You need to show your identification. You might need to record your mobile phone number. Some buildings use biometrics, so thumbprints, for example. The same is true now electronically. So if we think about SingPass, or internet banking here in Singapore, we've increased security standards repeatedly over the years. So we've gone from a simple internet banking used to just be username, password, bang, you can do anything you like, to now having two-factor authentication. We went through the period of dongles. We've now got the token on your phones. We're now using biometrics to access SingPass with things like the QR codes. So we've stepped up levels of access over time to make it more stringent and reduce the chance of it being manipulated or misused. Our objectives should include things like data loss prevention, improved security of system and network services, and proactive data management. Proactivity means getting on the front foot. When we look at a risk regulatory compliance perspective, most things have always been done reactively. We're trying to fix a problem that's already occurred. If we can be more proactive and do things better in the first place, we could minimize that event occurring in the first place. Much more economically beneficial for an organization to not have to fix problems if they don't occur in the first place. We should have then information security policies, standards, and guidelines. So baseline things, so this type of things I just mentioned, it's like basic password information. We get this a lot now where passwords can't just be letters. They're going to be numbers and letters. They might have to mix in capitals. They might have to mix in lowercase. You might have to mix in other symbols, for example, an asterisk or an exclamation mark. You might also need additional questions, like prompting questions, things about your mother's maiden name or your first school, for example. This should then provide a security baseline, clearance baseline for all departments, so aligns to business objectives. Risk in a business is based on objectives, so the risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So how does what we do from a cybersecurity perspective tie in to our business objectives? There are three broad cyber goals we can look at in business: confidentiality, availability, and integrity. So confidentiality, the idea that information should only be seen or accessed by people who are authorized to access it. When we look at this area of business, access to information should be a bit like a pyramid. So, we've got a triangle, and at the top should be a very small number of people. These are the people that have access to a lot of information. Information should be need to know. Those people are what we might look at as an author, so an information author. They can create new information. They can manipulate the majority of existing information, change and delete as necessary. That should be a very, very small number of people with the highest level of security access. We might then have, in the middle level, people who can view information and make changes to non-sensitive data. So they might be able to update broad audit type information, but not change things like passwords or access codes. At the bottom of the pyramid, the largest number of people might be people that can just see, they're read only. They can see things, but they can't make any edits or changes. So only having access to authorization to change or access for people that really need it. Integrity means that the information is tracked. So we've got an audit trail of everything that happens. We always know what the information said at a given point in time. So if we're asked, we can say on this date at this time, this is what the information said, this is how it was captured and stored. And availability, information needs to be accessible when authorized users need it. This is where there's a difference between data being taken away or manipulated compared to it being wiped. If it's completely removed from a system, how do we recover that? Is it available when it's needed? Now, data breaches tend to be pretty sophisticated, and we can look at different charts for this. On the screen is an example of what this might look like. Research tends to be done by organized groups that are working on the cybersecurity area. These guys very sophisticated, often large in number. So when we come back later on, I'll show you some information on a group from North Korea. Group known as Lazarus, that's estimated to be up to 6,000 people. It's part of the North Korean army. So this is a group that hacks that's 6,000 strong. It's a huge number of people that are doing research on cybercrime and hacking of institutions on a regular basis. People look for weaknesses they can exploit. The most obvious weakness tends to be us, humans. And normally we're exploited from one of two things. One of them is fear, one of them is greed. Fear, we're scared for something. We think someone has information on us, or we're doing something that we shouldn't be and they know, so we give up information we shouldn't. And greed, we're exploited because we're greedy. I'm sure all of you on the call have probably at some point in your life received an email from somebody normally in a different country, often a place like Nigeria, that tells you that you've come into a lot of money. One of your relatives might have recently passed away and left you $30 million. And if you send me $10,000, I'll send you the rest. And people are greedy and people fall for it. A Malaysian recently lost over $100,000 to a scam like this in the last month, sending money online to somebody they've never met because they're greedy and they think they've got something for nothing. So often people are exploited for fear and greed. So there can be two types of an attack: social engineering, where we are exploited, individuals like us are exploited to access information, or things like infrastructural weaknesses where we're connecting on the internet, for example, without adequate protection. So think about this at the moment from a cyber risk perspective. People like us working at home on potentially personal devices without suitable firewalls, without suitable virus screening software, without suitable access controls in place, linking to Wi-Fi at home that has very basic security control, like on your router. So for example, a basic password, which can be exploited, like using things like SQL injection. So there's different types of attacks that can happen. Data then tends to be exfiltrated, so it's taken out. This is what we saw in the SingHealth attack, for example. Data is, in that case, some data was moved, but that data was primarily taken, normally for the purpose of it being economically viable to be sold or distributed somehow. So, for example, health information, very valuable for insurance, let's say. Data can then be used by the attacker, so taken back, exfiltrated back at the end here on the path. One of the biggest data breaches, and the reason I'll show you this one is it's a huge breach, but also there's been some resolution of this in the last, well, just less than a year. This is a company called Equifax, which a lot of people haven't heard of. It's not the sort of thing that you would necessarily deal with as an individual. It's similar in many respects to something like Credit Bureau Singapore. It's a credit-based agency, and in 2017, it notified people it was a victim of a hack, where they lost about 143 million customers' records, including social security numbers. Now, in America, there's no nationalized identification system like we have in Singapore with our NRIC. So social security numbers fulfill a very similar purpose. They're used for many interactions with government. Now, what's typical in cases like this, and this happens repeatedly, is there's a major event. And what makes the event worse is the response to it from a PR side. As you can see in the timeline here, the notification of a data breach has often been very, very poor. So it's taken companies a very long time to actually announce that this happened. You see here, for example, that the data breach, Equifax realized as far back as March in 2017, and then notified people in September 2017. What's happened with more recent law, for example, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, as well as changing law here under the PDPA, is that institutions will be given a much shorter time frame, normally 3 days, to notify the public when they've been hacked. The chart I showed you earlier, the Yahoo data breach, it took Yahoo literally years to announce that they'd been the victim of a hack. We found out years after it. So we're now saying this isn't good enough. We want to know much faster. 143 million people thought to be affected, including names, dates of birth, social security information, passports, and payment card numbers. Certain information, what we look at as PPI, PII, personally identifiable information, is very important to protect adequately, primarily names, date of births, and things like an ID number. For example, in Singapore, our NRIC. Now, the reason for that, when you think about it, it's fairly obvious. Names do change and can change, but most people don't change their name very often. Dates of birth don't change. They're fixed. You're stuck with one, right? It's very hard, very difficult, very rare to change your date of birth. And the same is true in Singapore of your IC number. So once you get somebody's IC number, their name, and their date of birth, there can only be one person like that. That data is very valuable because it can't be changed, it can't be amended. If we think here in Singapore with the SingHealth data breach, once that data's gone, it's gone forever. I can never get my data back, for example. I can never change my date of birth. I can never change my IC. Even if I change my name, the other two things are static. They're the static identifier. So it's a huge issue from a risk perspective. Now, I mentioned just now that there was a bit of a resolution in this case. Equifax have signed an agreement with the Federal Trade Commission in the US, which is one of the regulatory bodies. Their penalty for this will be somewhere between $400 and $700 million. Now, that's just not just a penalty, but having to pay money up to $125 per person back to their customers. So if you had to pay up to $125 a person to 143 million people, very expensive. So they're looking at up to $700 million for this. again, compare that to Sing Health, where I don't know about you guys, but I received absolutely no compensation for what happened. I don't recall ever receiving an apology from anybody that they lost my data. I didn't know they had in the first place. I'm not suggesting, by the way, you should call up Sing Health over the next few days and claim your money back. But this is a huge, huge penalty we saw here in America, and we haven't quite seen the same thing locally. Maybe we will in time. In terms of current risk, we know at the moment that there are major problems in the way that technology works from a cyber perspective in companies. This is a quote from earlier this year from a report that was done in Europe across financial institutions for cybersecurity. I think the first paragraph here, I think, is probably the most interesting for me. Cyber risk reports were compiled by IT specialists for other IT specialists. The reports were very technical, provided little to no guidance for executive decision making. Executives found the risks did not help them interpret how cyber risk is related to other risks. So in this scenario, we've got very good, no doubt, data provided, but very technical technology, IT-based data provided to senior management to make decisions who fundamentally don't understand it. Now, I've seen this, I've worked in governance, risk, compliance areas for over a decade, seen this repeatedly, where somebody produces a whiz-bang report on something for management, but the management have no idea what any of it means. It's not been broken down for a layman, a normal person to understand. This leads to something like we see on the screen here. The current situation is a mess. We do not have the facts to decide on actions, and the paralysis puts our business at risk. Without having a joined up strategy where business, legal, IT, compliance, risks, senior management, audit are all working together, it's really hard to make good, effective decisions as it relates to cybersecurity. Some more data here from the same report from earlier this year. In terms of current threats we're seeing, more than 99% of threats observed required human interaction. So this is the idea of that social engineering. So opening files or macros, following links, so clicking on a web link, opening documents. And the most common way this is done is using information that looks like it comes from Microsoft. So for example, an email that says it comes from Outlook saying you need to update your password, or it comes from Teams saying you need to change something on your profile. So Microsoft is one of the most commonly used Office electronic products, and so it's easy to target people because nearly everybody uses it in some way or form. So nearly 1 in 4 phishing emails were associated with Microsoft in 2018, which is huge. It happens now with things like OneDrive, so the shift online is the same. I quite frequently get phishing emails that look like they come from Federal Express or also from Dropbox. You get the same here in Singapore on the phone. I get calls fairly regularly from somebody talking Chinese, telling me I've got deliveries from DHL that I don't have, and they want me to call up a number and give certain information. So they want me to call up and give my name and my IC so they can then get that for their benefit. People have become threat actors, so people that are trying to commit cybercrime have become more sophisticated. So they don't just do something once and then move on. If they're going to use the exploitation, they carry on doing it. Something to consider from a business environment with cybercrime: people don't hack differently based on the type of organization you are. So they don't hack differently today because you're a medical device company and hack somebody differently tomorrow because you work in telecommunications. The tools they're using are broadly similar. Right, so using a Microsoft lure is the same if you're in either of those businesses. Social engineering is broadly the same across all different business lines. So actually, from a crime perspective, it's a very efficient way of carrying out crime. You can use the same techniques across every type of business anywhere in the world, and you don't have to be there. So it's a very efficient way of carrying out crime. Most threats then are people-centric. So we are targeted. Right, it's not just VIPs, senior people, but what we look at is very attacked people. So people in certain elements of organizations who have lots of data available online. So for example, people that you can find their email addresses, their names, their contact information on websites like LinkedIn or on Twitter, for example, or on just the general internet. The more information that's publicly available, the higher the risk that people will be exposed. I know, for example, like my company email address is online on our website as well as on my LinkedIn. And that as soon as that happens, you start getting spam email left, right, and center. It's the reality that my email needs to be available for people. There's no point having it otherwise. But as soon as you do that, you open yourself up for potential avenues of cybercrime. imposters do mimic business routines, so they'll message at the same time as other organizational messaging. See here, like traffic, for example, malicious messages distributed differently over different days a week. People are much more likely to do this early in the week when at work they're much more sort of engaged, and they'll also, threat actors will also change based on time of day. So Asia Pacific, North America, much more likely to be up early risers, do things early in the day. Europe, Middle East, much more likely to be later in the day after lunch, based on when business works, when people do things in a normal business setting. So we know that these people are sophisticated and follow general trends of business. A couple of things that, and I'll show you this because the next screen relates to something that happened in Singapore last year. Hackers move, right? So they don't just keep doing the same thing again and again. They will if it's lucrative, but they run out of avenues after a while. So criminal gangs will start moving to different elements of business. Over the last few years, crypto exchanges, of which there are a number in Singapore, have been the target or potential target of hacks. You can see 2018, nearly $1 billion. And I just mentioned that one of these was in Singapore. So this is from 2019. You see the one here called Dragon X. I don't know if I can annotate this. Yeah, I can. Here. This was in Singapore. So this was over $7 million worth of things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, Ripple, or XRP, stolen last year from exchange in Singapore. So this has happened for a number of years all over the world. And the volumes are going up and up as more people, cryptocurrency value has gone up or went up for a while. Stealing them becomes lucrative, and they are, again, less well protected typically than other elements of business. If we think about, so far, of all the Bitcoin ever mined, as it were, sort of created, over 10% has been lost or stolen. Now, if this was, for any of you as an individual, if you've got a bank account with DBS or OCBC or UOB, if every month 10% of your salary was lost or stolen, you'd be pretty furious about it. So that's actually remarkable that people carry on with these things. People, of course, there is some value that is associated with it, but this is a huge opportunity for hackers and criminal gangs. You see Coinbene at the top here. This one, over 100 million stolen, right? And the groups are very sophisticated. The hack in Singapore was perpetrated by the Lazarus group from North Korea, mimicking setting up a fake website that looked like a real website to generate, or for people to log in and give their crypto keys. Oh, what have I done here? I need to clear my annotation, do I? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Apologies if you can hear some rumbling in the background. We're having what I can only describe as an enormous thunderstorm up here in Tampines. So if we think about how this ties into the data protection side, data breaches, there are standard provisions you get in data law, give or take, everywhere in the world. Now, most countries have developed more robust data protection law in recent years. Singapore, of course, PDPA. We have a Data Protection Act in Malaysia. There's Data Protection Ordinance in Hong Kong as well. And now there is GDPR in Europe, getting more robust and more sophisticated as time goes by. Of course, they're always playing catch up to some extent because now technology is moving way faster than creation and updating of law in most cases. So broadly, information normally that's collected, needs to be used fairly, lawfully, and transparently, and used for specified explicit purposes. Different law varies in terms of how you can collect it and what it's used for, but generally it needs to be adequate, relevant, and limited to only what's necessary. We've seen changes here, of course, in Singapore over the last 6 months. 9 months, I should say, particularly with things like the collection of NRIC numbers. You know, it's become now not acceptable in most scenarios to collect an NRIC. So people can collect, for example, half an NRIC or use other data for verification. We get certain events, of course, the pandemic we're in at the moment, that changes things somewhat. Although the reality is, you see a lot on the news at the moment about we're collecting data that goes against PDPA, but under PDPA in Singapore, you can collect data with the consent can be deemed. So, you know, if you're giving the data, you're deeming to have given consent. So, for example, if you're willing to, on your phone, scan a QR code and say, you know, verify your information, you're deemed to be giving consent by doing that in the first place. Whereas under law like GDPR in Europe, you've got to have explicit consent, where it's not good enough to imply that somebody says yes, they have to physically say yes every time it's collected. Some things have stronger provisions, and of course, these types of things vary significantly in different jurisdictions. So, data relating to things like race or ethnic background, political opinions, membership of things like trade union and genetics. So, these are seen as particularly sensitive. Another one I should add in here, actually, anything to do with children, anything to do with minors is much more sensitive because they're often not able to make their own decision themselves. Now, over the last couple of years, we've seen a tightening of law, and there's been frustration, I guess, amongst data protection advocates around the world, particularly in Europe, that the law that was changed in Europe, which is known as GDPR, we haven't had any really big major cases quite yet. So I'll just see if I can highlight that for you. It's written here. GDPR came into force in 2018, it was passed in 2016, and it was really targeted primarily at the large US tech companies, your Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, etc. And none of them have been fined yet, although there is a case pending in Ireland against Twitter. Is probably going to be the first really big fine. This is a case from 2018 from British Airways in the UK, the airline company. They lost, you can see here, 380,000 customer records. So their website was hacked, and they took usernames and passwords, as well as, critically, credit card details. Now, the thing here is websites can store credit card details, but they shouldn't store the CVV, the security number. And the British Airways website was storing them. So it opened up, once that was hacked, you can take the credit card details and use them to commit fraud by buying things online, which criminals did. So they lost 380,000 customer records. They then had a record-breaking fine of £183 million. Now, the previous biggest fine the UK, in this case, could deliver for a data breach was £500,000, which is $500,000. This case, then, 183 million. So the jump has gone from this big to huge in the space of literally months. So could have been a lot worse for them. They were also being sued by customers for over $500 million. They also had to pay back They also had to pay back over £1,200 to each customer that was a victim of data breach. So $183 million, absolutely huge fine. Really the first sort of significantly big fine. On the diagram I showed you earlier, there was also reference to the Marriott data breach. Marriott lost 500 million customer records. In 2018, they were a victim of a different data breach, and that cost them £91 million, so significant as well. Now, there are bigger fines. Of course, America can give bigger fines than basically anywhere else. So when America distribute fines to people, they tend to be the biggest of the big. In this case, this is Facebook from last year. This relates to the US election in 2016, the issues with data manipulation there. And their fine was $5 billion, which is a staggeringly high amount, even for a company like Facebook. On the one hand, $5 billion to Facebook isn't that much, but it's still huge, right? In the scale of how big penalties get, this is, way up there. And so there's been a big push in recent years to really push back on the large technology companies who have been able to run wild with data collection. The reality for us as consumers is, by now, for most of us, it's a bit too late. We've given the data already, right? So I've been on Facebook since 2006. It's too late. My data's out there. Who they've sold it to, I have no idea. Who the people they've sold it to have sold it to, I also have no idea. It could have been sold around the world 10 times by now. So this is a huge problem that we potentially face. The reason this became a bit more of an issue here is because it happened, right? So we always look at these things. Everybody does this with an air of complacency. It never happened to me, therefore I'm fine. And actually, for us as individuals, we look at certain things slightly differently. So health is a good example. I'm sure a lot of you on this call, of course, we have MediSave here in Singapore. I'm sure a lot of you also have personal insurance. One of those things that you're willing to pay for that you hope you never use. So you want to buy medical insurance with the hope that you never have to claim it. But we don't do that with other things. We think it will never happen. We'll never be a victim. Therefore, we just sort of don't do anything. This is the message I got. Some of you, I'm sure, had a similar message. This is a couple of years back now, 2018. Your name, IC address, gender, race, and birthday were accessed but not altered. It wouldn't have made any difference if they altered them in a system. I mean, if you change my date of birth in a computer system, it doesn't actually change my date of birth. So it wouldn't have made any difference. The fact that they've accessed it and they've potentially taken it is a much bigger problem. We apologize for anxiety caused. No action needed. When I read that, the first thing I thought was I disagree. I think there is some action needed. What I found interesting here, I touched on this earlier, is there was never a follow-up. There was never a, here's what we've done to rectify it, we're very sorry. It was just sort of this one message on SMS. And it was also delivered, as you can see, 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. This is the best time for anybody out there. Let's see if I can, I'm trying to get my thing. What have I done with it? I don't know. So this is the best time, Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, to deliver bad news to somebody. So if you you want to tell them that something bad is happening, this is a good time to do it. So Sing Health system hit by most serious breach of personal data in cyber attack. There was a huge focus here. I'm sure a lot of you recall this, on it being linked to the Prime Minister. The reality is, it's important, of course, to reference why do they want the Prime Minister's data, but actually for most individuals, they should be much more concerned about their own. The other thing here is a lot of it focused on the medical side. The reality for medical data is useful, it is economically viable, but for most people, it doesn't mean that much. You can figure out someone's medical history, half of it, by looking at them. The things I touched on earlier, your name, your IC number, your date of birth, static data that can never be changed, much more valuable. Once you can get that and a picture of somebody online, you can become them, right? So you can replicate yourself as they are just by doing something. This is, I won't go through all of this, but you can see here, like, there's a good timeline. This was published in from the Business Times, sorry, Straits Times, and published in Singapore Law Watch. A really good way of, like, the initial breach, probably a front-end workstation, so malware through a social engineering attack, which is fairly common in terms of accessing systems and the way people get in, and then collection of patient data. The thing I think is could have been better here is the discovering the breach from 4th of July, and then not notifying people until the 20th of July. It's actually quite a long time, right? So in the middle, there were a lot of problems that occurred. I'll go through some of them in a minute, but a lot of problems in terms of delays. For example, the person that first uncovered it didn't report it because it would have meant having to do more work, which, when you find that out, is a pretty galling thing to hear. You didn't report the country's biggest ever data breach because it would make everyone a bit more busy. It's a pretty depressing thing to find out that happened. The government then came out, and of course there is a report that was on this, and there's two different reports. There's the publicly available report, which we can see, and then there's the report the government had, which we'll go into a lot more technical detail. The work of a typical state-linked group. A typical state-linked group, what's known as an APT, an advanced persistent threat. That's the countries I mentioned earlier: US, Russia, China, North Korea, Israel. In this case, if you think of the timing involved, this was very close to the time of Singapore hosting the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. So unlikely, given that Singapore rolled out the red carpet at the cost of $20 million, that it would have been the US or North Korea based on time. Russia are not known to target Singapore and not known to target health data. So unlikely it would have been them. Israel, we don't have any particular beef with Israel, and they're also not known to target those types of things, which leaves China. Of course, China, the jurisdiction that was sort of left out as the US and North Korea were having their meetings, also a place that will take any sort of data they can get if they think they get away with it and get money. Probably the most likely. Now, the government, of course, know exactly who it is, but they haven't told us publicly, which is probably a good thing. But it would have been a state-linked group. Now, the probe reported, and we had an initial report that came out, then the full report, pointed to basic failings. There are a whole number of things that went wrong here that could be rectified in the future. So staff lacking training in cybersecurity, failing to take required action, there was weaknesses in network and unfixed systems, attackers were skilled. There's nothing you can do about that one as such. So, the fact that the attackers are very, very good is something we have to prepare against because we can't diminish their quality. And we were ultimately let down by vulnerable systems and untrained staff. A lot of these things are things that can actually could be, relatively speaking, improved fairly easily. So enhanced security structure and readiness to be adopted, online security process reviewed, awareness on cybersecurity must be improved to prevent, detect, and respond. So from a risk and compliance perspective, our three internal control provisions we can put in place are prevention, detection, and response. Enhanced security checks on critical information infrastructure. Singapore has 11 CII systems or sort of sections, including healthcare. Privilege administrator accounts subject to tighter control. So this is that idea of triple multi-factor authentication, MFA. There were also then additional recommendations outside of priority recommendations. So IT security risk assessments. This for me should have happened anyway. This should be a priority. No organization can set their control framework, the prevention, detection, response, if they haven't done a risk assessment. It just doesn't make sense. It's madness to have this as a non-priority area. It should have been really one of the first things to be done. Enhanced safeguards, patch management, software upgrades, etc. So there's a whole range of things that came out in the report that could be done better. There hasn't been a lot of follow-up on this since in terms of what has been done differently. If you think about it, of course, for us as consumers, we don't choose as such to use SingHealth or somebody else. In this case, always important to remember, it wasn't directly SingHealth that were breached, it was IHIS, which is very common in data breaches, that it's the third party. So not the primary organization, but the third party down the chain. In this case, IHIS. And I'm sure a significant change have been made both at the SingHealth side and IHIS, that they have across the country. But really, there's a lot that needed to be updated following that particular breach. Of course, because SingHealth has an IHIS access to such a wide range of national data, in this case, millions of consumer records, very important that there's a robust system in place. What sometimes happens with situations like this is other issues get almost forgotten about or overlooked because the big thing that happens becomes front of mind. So literally days after, we found out about this, most people on about the 20th or 21st of July. On the 26th of July, the cybersecurity agency in Singapore announced that a group known as SIAS, the Securities Investors Association of Singapore, had been breached, and 70,000 members had their personal particulars accessed, but it was in 2013, so 5 years before, and nobody knew. So the website was breached in 2013. Nobody knew for 5 years until SingHealth happened and cybersecurity agencies started doing testing on other website portals. Portals are particularly vulnerable, and they uncovered this huge data breach. Now, this got lost in the ether of what was happening around SingHealth. 70,000 people is nothing compared to 1.5 million, but this is still an enormous amount of records that were lost without us really having any idea. And it just sort of swamped based on a different news story. Let me just... Oh, what have I done? So I touched a couple of times on like other things that happen. In this case, I'll show you some brief information about ransomware that we've seen. And this was from a few years back now, 2017, called WannaCry. There were two ransomware attacks that were large scale in 2017. One was called WannaCry and one was called NotPetya. This was WannaCry, where it's effectively blackmail. Your files have been hacked and are stolen. And if you pay money, you can get them back. In this case, you can pay your money in Bitcoin, the idea being it's got a relative level of anonymity. Of course, what actually happens in practice is if you pay the money, you're still not getting your files back. The general rule of thumb, don't pay the ransom. It almost invariably works out very badly. You never get your money back and you lose a lot. So this was a large data breach. WannaCry affected hundreds of millions of machines all over the world. And you can see here how the attack spread. So truly sort of global in nature. The countries in red are countries that were affected by this particular piece of ransomware. Large things that were bad was stuff like in the UK, the National Health Service, so a bit like SingHealth here, had 70,000 machines that went offline. Now, if you imagine those are machines that are helping keep people alive in hospitals, if they go offline, that's pretty bad. But also there's a financial cost involved for people around the world who are ransomed. A couple of good examples of that. This is Recordbreaking, who make things like Nurofen. Cost them about £100 million. So that's at the time about 200 million Singapore dollars. This is from their systems being offline for a period of time. And probably the biggest impact was the shipping company Maersk, who were a victim of the cyber attack, and they estimated it cost them 300 million. Their systems were offline for just under 6 weeks, so about $50 million a week it cost them for their systems being down. So it's a huge economic financial cost to pay, as well as the reputational side, issues with business that is shut for a period of time, supply chain, etc. Now, an interesting case that came up at the beginning of last year. This is based on the same cyber attack, NotPetya, in 2017. A company called Mondelez. Mondelez is an American food company. They own people like Kraft and Cadbury, so they make a lot of snacks and biscuits. And they were the victim of ransomware, so they claimed on their insurance from their insurance providers, a company called Zurich. They said, we were the victims of this hack, and it cost us about $100 million, therefore we're claiming it on our insurance. Now, the NotPetya attack was perpetrated by a group from Russia. The Russian hacking groups tend to be known by bears like Fancy Bear and Lazy Bear. The insurance company Zurich said, we're not paying the insurance claim because you were hacked by Russia, which we consider to be an act of war, and we don't insure for acts of war. So they said a cyber attack in this case is an act of war. So Mondelez has taken them to court in the UK and said, we want 100 million. If you're not going to insure for cyber attacks carried out by states, you need to make new cyber policy coverage. And I know, here in Singapore now, even for small businesses, there's been a lot of news this year so far about trying to upgrade cyber and data protection insurance coverage for this type of reason. So this group behind WannaCry and a lot of other hacks, including things like Sony, known as Lazarus Group from North Korea. There's a really good set of articles online about the Lazarus Group. If you look them up, there's plenty of information, a lot of it from the FBI in the US. They're a hacker group. They hack primarily for money. They will hack on behalf of others for a fee, but they do a lot of it to generate revenue for themselves. At the moment, their favored thing seems to be stealing cryptocurrencies, which they then move all around the world in crazy patterns and then resell eventually in different wallets in different locations. A very good article from a website called GP Investigations that you can look up, how North Korean hackers became the world's greatest bank robbers. The big thing they did in 2017 was hacking the Central Bank of Bangladesh. It's a bit like hacking the Monetary Authority of Singapore. They stole $81 million. They tried to steal nearly $1 billion. They got blocked. The transactions got blocked by one of the banking groups involved. They got away with 101 million. 20 million was then blocked in transit, and they successfully stole $81 million from a central bank in less than 3 days. So it's a significant amount of money to steal from a central banking group over the course of a long weekend. The type of thing they've been doing, this is from that same article. It's just a snapshot because it's too big to fit on screen. It's a PDF, about 3 pages long. This is from 2011 to 2018. This hacking group, Lazarus, stealing money, digital currencies, etc. They've got away with about $650 million out of an attempted 1.8 billion. Pretty good hit rate. They're successful a third of the time. So if you're successful a third of the time, but you're doing it remotely from the comfort of your office in Pyongyang, it's pretty risk-free from their perspective. And to have thousands of people sat around in the North Korean army in an office, stealing $650 million in 7 years, pretty good return on investment. They've also one of the first groups, Lazarus, to figure out how to use a variant of a malware in cryptocurrencies to steal from Mac devices. So people tend to look at Mac operating software, so Apple, as being more secure than Windows, which it generally is. But they've, in 2018, figured out how to use Mac to target cryptocurrencies. So they've broadened the range of skills they've had to target new threat environments. As recently as the last month, this is from the US Department of Homeland Security and CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, warning of the North Korean cyber threat. It's become much more prominent, this issue, not just Lazarus, there are other groups, Unit 120 and Cobra, for example, in terms of the threat they're posing to business. As I said, last year, the FBI put 2 North Koreans on a wanted list. They also arrested an American citizen in Singapore who was in North Korea giving advice on cryptocurrencies. He's been arrested under financial crime, money laundering offenses. So they're really stepping up what they're doing on this front. In terms of a few things you can do, and I won't go through all of these, we do on the full day-long workshop, but a few sort of basic things you can start looking at from an organizational perspective to try and manage cybersecurity in your organization. Things to consider, including network security, basic stuff. If the perimeter, the outside is protected, then things can't get in. So this is our lines of defense idea. Prevention against malware, system monitoring and incident management, training and awareness for staff, so the type of thing that was referenced in the Sing Health report. Home and mobile working, which is a big issue at the moment. What are we doing as it relates to devices? I know a lot of organizations block access to certain websites, or they require you to use a company mobile phone. But the reality is the data is never truly secure. It can be copied. Even for somebody that's got a phone, if something's on a screen, you can take a photo of it. So how do you prevent that from happening? It becomes almost impossible to do in reality. Secure configuration, so updates for patches and technology systems, making sure they're set well. Removable media such as USBs. A lot of organizations now don't allow things like USBs. We used to use, of course, things like CD-ROMs, but this has become less common. Just by removing USBs and moving things in the cloud doesn't resolve your problem. It really moves your problem. So how are you securing things in the cloud? And then access privileges I touched on earlier, things like the pyramid. So read only at the bottom, changing, and then the author at the top. And just something to think about is the idea of working remotely. Big challenge at the moment. This will change, I think, probably the way we go forward as well. The range and rate of scams has increased and fraud online over recent weeks, all around the world. That's true. Think about security on that front. How do we secure things more adequately? Most organizations, I think, distribute, manage, and hold too much data in the first place. Most take things they don't need. And now there's a risk of it being misused because of the pandemic we're sort of in the middle of. So how do we start managing those things appropriately from a cyber perspective? So I appreciate that was a bit of a whirlwind, but just a look at some of the things that are key issues at the moment. Of course, as I said, this is evolving literally every day. We'll go through this in more detail on our workshop coming up in a few weeks. But I'm happy to, I know that I've spoken a lot and you guys have been listening very patiently. I'm happy to take questions.